Centuries ago, galactic bureaucrats outlawed orbital bombardments, plasma strikes, and mass infantry invasions. Lawmakers thought they had achieved universal peace overnight. Nobody remembered to outlaw compound interest. When humanity realized our dreadnought fleets were suddenly illegal, we didn't just roll over and disarm. We traded our admirals for aggressive accountants, replacing railguns with predatory lending. We learned that starving a planetary system by shorting their agricultural index is far quieter than glassing their continents. Welcome to the new war. Stale ozone and cheap synthesized tobacco masked the scent of desperation in the docking bay, but Ainsley Steeves could still smell it. It clung to the heavy, humid air of Station Jericho like wet wool. He stood at the edge of Pier 4, gripping a cracked datapad. His thumb, calloused from years of gripping a standard-issue pulse rifle, now rested heavily on a glowing yellow icon that read, "Execute transfer." Ainsley hated the humidity. It made his bad knee ache, a lingering souvenir from the mud-soaked trenches of the Sirius campaign, back when wars were fought with hot shrapnel and adrenaline instead of spreadsheets. Now his armor was a charcoal grey wool suit that trapped the heat, and his weapon was a legally binding injunction authorized by the Soul Banking Guild. Below him, resting in the cradle of the massive orbital dry dock, sat the Vanguard. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, 3 kilometers of reinforced titanium armor, plating bristling with decommissioned heavy-mass drivers and silent plasma batteries. A week ago, it was the flagship of the local defense coalition. Today, it was collateral. A heavy thud echoed across the metal grating of the gantry. Ainsley didn't turn around. He just listened to the scuff of steel-toed boots approaching. "You can't be serious," a gravelly voice barked over the hum of the station's life support turbines. Ainsley turned slowly. The dockmaster was a massive man named Harrison, his coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid, and his face flushed with a dangerous shade of red. Harrison wasn't military, but he had the thick neck and heavy shoulders of a man who spent his life breaking up fights in zero-gravity bars. "I am entirely serious, Harrison," Ainsley said, his voice flat. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. The coalition missed their 3rd consecutive payment on the high-yield sovereign bonds they issued to Earth. As per the Treaty of 2241, sovereign default triggers asset seizure. "It's a warship, Steeves." Harrison gestured wildly at the massive hull below them. "You don't just repossess a dreadnought like it's a busted hover sedan. We have a crew of 4,000 men and women on board, right now running diagnostics. You think they're just going to pack their bags and walk off?" Ainsley sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The harsh neon lights of the dock were giving him a migraine. They don't have a choice. As of 4 minutes ago, their payroll accounts have been frozen. The oxygen scrubbers on decks 4 through 9 have been throttled to conservation mode because the utility company refuses to extend them any further credit. Harrison stared at him, the anger slowly draining from his face, replaced by a cold, creeping horror. "You cut their air?" "I didn't cut anything," Ainsley corrected, holding up the datapad. "The automated market algorithms did. Once the default registered in the central exchange, their credit rating dropped to sub-junk status. The life support grid requires a microtransaction every minute to keep the scrubbers running at full capacity. No credit, no air. It's not a weapon, Harrison. It's just accounting." The sheer absurdity of it tasted bitter in Ainsley's mouth. 10 years ago, taking a dreadnought required a fleet action. Thousands of men would die in a blinding flash of nuclear fire. Mothers would receive folded flags. Politicians would give somber speeches. Now Ainsley literally pressed a button. An invisible line of code traveled across the comms relay, and the mighty Vanguard died in its sleep. "They're humans, Ainsley. Just like us," Harrison muttered, his voice cracking. The Assembly banned war so we wouldn't slaughter each other. This what you're doing. It's sicker. The Assembly banned kinetic violence, Ainsley said, his tone devoid of any defense or pride. They mandated free trade and unregulated financial markets. Humanity just read the fine print. Ainsley tapped the yellow icon on his screen. The datapad chimed a cheerful melodic tone. Deep within the bowels of the Vanguard, a low mechanical groan resonated as the massive primary fusion reactors powered down. The internal lights of the dreadnought flickered from a bright operational white to a dim, sickly emergency amber. 4,000 crewmen were now sitting in the dark, breathing stale air, completely unemployed and utterly defeated, without a single shot being fired. Ainsley turned his back on the dying ship and began the long walk toward the human sector. His knee flared with every step on the metal grating. He felt no victory, only an exhausting, hollow fatigue that settled deep into his bones. He needed a drink. But first he needed to see Brianna. Brianna Cook's office was a claustrophobic box located deep in the administrative underbelly of the station. It smelled strongly of burnt chicory ozone and old paper. While the rest of the galaxy had embraced holographic displays, Brianna insisted on keeping physical ledgers stacked on her desk, creating a chaotic fortress of data. Ainsley pushed the heavy door open. The air inside was stiflingly warm. Brianna sat bathed in the harsh blue glow of 3 oversized cracked monitors. Her fingers flew across a mechanical keyboard with a frantic, rhythmic clacking. She didn't look up when Ainsley walked in. She never did. "Tell me the Vanguard is secured," she said, her voice sharp and rapid. She grabbed a ceramic mug off a stack of risk assessment reports and took a sip, grimacing at the cold coffee. "It's secured," Ainsley said, collapsing into the single uncomfortable guest chair. It creaked under his weight. "Reactor is in standby. Crew is evacuating under emergency protocols. Harrison looked like he wanted to throw me off the gantry." "Harrison is a sentimental idiot," Brianna replied, finally pausing her typing. She spun her chair around to face him. She was pale with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of chemically induced sleeplessness. "He looks at a dreadnought and sees a protector. I look at it and see a massive depreciating liability, draining 3 million credits a day in maintenance alone." Securing it was just the first phase. Ainsley leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So we have the ship. The local coalition is officially bankrupt. What's the play here, B? We can't sell a dreadnought on the open market. The Galactic Council monitors heavy arms sales." "We aren't going to sell it," Brianna said, a thin, humorless smile touching her lips. "We are going to use it as an anchor." She reached out and tapped a key. One of the large monitors flickered, displaying a complex web of financial derivatives, colored in angry reds and aggressive greens. "I've been digging through the sovereign debt structures of the outer colonies," Brianna explained, her eyes reflecting the data. "When the Assembly outlawed war, these planetary governments panicked. They didn't have defense budgets anymore, so they poured all their capital into infrastructure. Megacities, orbital tethers, terraforming engines, and they financed all of it through Sol banking." Ainsley watched the numbers crawl across the screen. "Right. We became the galaxy's bank, exactly. But here is the structural weakness," Brianna said, leaning over her desk, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "These colonies backed their loans with their primary commodities. For this sector, it's agricultural yield, specifically synthetic grain from the breadbasket worlds. The Council thinks their economy is bulletproof because people always need to eat." Ainsley rubbed his eyes. The migraine was settling in behind his temples. "I'm an auditor, B, not a macroeconomist. Get to the point." Brianna sighed an exasperated sound. "The point, Ainsley, is that they collateralized their grain output based on the assumption of a stable supply chain. The Vanguard wasn't just a warship, It was the heavily armed escort for the massive agricultural freighters that move the grain through the disputed asteroid belts. The freighters rely on the dreadnought to clear micro-debris and deter pirates. Ainsley went perfectly still. The cold reality of her words began to seep into his tired brain. Without the Vanguard, insurance premiums on those shipping lanes skyrocket. Brianna finished, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying, cold logic. I already ran the simulations. Within 48 hours, the maritime insurance syndicates will refuse to cover the grain freighters without military escort. The freighters will stay in port. The grain won't ship. Ainsley felt a knot twist in his stomach. If the grain doesn't ship, the planetary markets panic. Food shortages. Speculative food shortages, Brianna corrected. The physical grain still exists, but the market trades on futures. When the market realizes the supply chain is halted, the price of grain futures will collapse. The colony's collateral will be rendered worthless overnight. A margin call, Ainsley whispered. The biggest margin call in galactic history, Brianna confirmed. When their collateral drops below the threshold, our smart contracts will automatically trigger. We won't just own their warship Ainsley. We will own their orbital tethers. We will own their terraforming engines. We will own the very dirt they walk on. All legally. All without firing a single plasma charge. Ainsley looked at the floor. The scuffed linoleum was cracked and peeling. He remembered the smell of burning flesh on Sirius. He remembered the screaming. He had thought when the Council banned war that he would never have to ruin lives again. He had joined the banking guild because he wanted order. He wanted civilized rules. But this wasn't civilized. It was a sterile, clean slaughter. Billions of people were about to lose their homes, their jobs, their entire futures, simply because Brianna noticed a vulnerability in an insurance algorithm. We are going to starve them, B, Ainsley said quietly. Not physically, but economically. We are going to plunge an entire sector into a depression they won't recover from for a century. Brianna's expression hardened. She set her mug down with a sharp clack. They borrowed the money, Ainsley. They signed the contracts. If they wanted to play in the big leagues, they should have read the terms of service. This is how humanity survives now. We don't have the strongest bodies or the most advanced energy shields. But we understand numbers. We weaponized the one thing the Council relies on. Before Ainsley could reply, the heavy iron door of the office swung open. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in an immaculately tailored midnight blue suit. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his shoes shone with a mirror polish that had never touched dockyard grime. He carried a sleek silver briefcase and wore an expression of supreme, condescending authority. I am afraid, the man said, his voice smooth as oiled glass, that the Soul Banking Guild will be doing no such thing. Brianna didn't flinch. She just narrowed her eyes. You're trespassing in a secure corporate sector. I am Governor Charles Belmont, the man said, stepping into the cramped office and wrinkling his nose at the smell of burnt chicory. Special liaison to the Galactic Council's Trade Commission, and I am here to issue a cease and desist. Charles Belmont possessed the kind of frictionless confidence that only came from generations of inherited wealth and absolute legal immunity. He did not ask for permission to sit. He simply pulled up a chair, brushed an invisible speck of dust from the seat, and sat down opposite Ainsley and Brianna. The physical contrast in the room was jarring. Ainsley in his rumpled heat-trapping suit looking like a tired bouncer. Brianna pale and feral behind her fortress of monitors. And Belmont, a vision of manicured bureaucratic perfection. Let us skip the pleasantries, Belmont said, placing his silver briefcase on Brianna's desk. He snapped the latches open with 2 sharp clicks. The Council has been monitoring the Soul Banking Guild's aggressive accumulation of sovereign debt in this sector. We tolerated it when it was isolated to minor infrastructure loans. However, your seizure of the Vanguard today crossed a definitive line. We executed a standard foreclosure on a defaulted asset. Ainsley said, his voice a low, steady rumble. Everything was filed properly with the Central Registry. You can check the timestamp. Belmont offered a patronizing smile. Oh, I have no doubt your paperwork is in order, Mr. Steves. Humanity is nothing if not pedantic. But the Council is not blind. We see the chain reaction you are attempting to initiate. You seize the escort halt. The grain shipments crash the commodity index and trigger a systemic default. Brianna leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Sounds like a sound investment strategy. Is there a law against maximizing shareholder value? There is a law against destabilizing a planetary government, Belmont countered sharply. He pulled a thick, actual paper document from his briefcase and slid it across the desk. This is an emergency injunction from the High Court of the Assembly. It freezes the Vanguard in a state of legal stasis and mandates a temporary restructuring of the Coalition's debt. Your margin call is officially blocked. The game is over, Miss Cook. The Council will not allow you to weaponize the market. Ainsley stared at the thick stack of legalese. It was a heavy, physical manifestation of Council authority. For a fleeting second, he felt a strange sense of relief. If Belmont stopped them, the sector would survive. The crushing guilt that had been building in his chest would dissipate. He wouldn't have to be the executioner today. He looked over at Brianna, expecting to see defeat. Instead, he saw the faint, terrifying shadow of a genuine smile. She didn't even look at the injunction. She kept her eyes locked on Belmont. Governor Belmont. Brianna said, her voice dropping into a low conversational tone. Are you familiar with the concept of a synchronized, collateralized debt obligation? Belmont frowned, clearly annoyed by the pivot. I am familiar with human financial instruments, yes, but they do not supersede an emergency injunction. They do when the injunction violates the foundational charter of the Council itself, Brianna replied. She reached forward and pushed the thick document back toward Belmont. You see, when you mandate a debt restructuring, you are artificially altering the risk profile of the bonds. You are changing the terms retroactively. To prevent a humanitarian crisis, Belmont said stiffly. To intervene in a free market, Brianna corrected her voice, rising in intensity. The Council's foundational charter, the very treaty that banned war states in Article 4, Section 12, that the Assembly shall make no law or intervention that impedes the automated execution of mutually agreed-upon financial contracts. It was the concession you gave humanity to convince us to scrap our nuclear arsenal. Belmont's patronizing smile finally faltered. This is an exceptional circumstance. The algorithm doesn't recognize exceptions, Ainsley said, suddenly, the realization dawning on him. He looked at Brianna, seeing the trap she had laid. If the Council intervenes and forces a restructuring, it triggers a credit event under the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. Brianna pointed a finger at Ainsley. Exactly. And guess who sold the credit default swaps on this sector's debt? We did. Soul Banking. Belmont looked between them, his manicured composure cracking. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I didn't just short the grain. Brianna said, her fingers flying over her keyboard again, pulling up a new, terrifyingly massive block of data on the main monitor. I insured the debt. I bought massive policies that pay out only if the Coalition defaults, or if a governing body forces a restructuring. The payout is tied directly to the central reserves of the Galactic Assembly. The small office suddenly felt very cold. If you block our margin call with that injunction, Brianna continued, her voice utterly devoid of mercy, you trigger the insurance payout. The Assembly will be legally obligated to pay Sol Banking 300 trillion credits in compensation by the end of the fiscal day. It will drain the central galactic treasury. You won't just crash this sector, Governor. You will bankrupt the entire council. Belmont stared at the screen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. He looked down at the physical injunction on the desk, his hand trembling slightly. You built a doomsday device, Belmont whispered, the horror absolute. Out of paper, out of math. We built a deterrent, Ainsley corrected softly. You took away our guns. So we found a way to hold the entire economy hostage. Mutual assured destruction, Governor. Just a different kind of fallout. Brianna stopped typing. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen. You have exactly 2 minutes to withdraw that injunction before the central exchange closes, Belmont. Either this sector burns or the galaxy burns. Choose. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans on Brianna's servers. Ainsley watched Belmont. He watched the absolute destruction of a man's worldview happen in real time. Belmont wasn't a soldier. He had never faced the barrel of a gun. But right now, staring at a spreadsheet, he looked exactly like a man standing on a landmine, hearing the click. With a shaky mechanical motion, Belmont reached out, picked up the physical injunction, and shoved it back into his briefcase. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at either of them. He just stood up, his perfect posture gone, and walked out of the office, leaving the door open behind him. Brianna exhaled a long, shuddering breath. She reached out and hit a single key. Execute. The margin call went through. Almost instantly, the station's overhead lights flickered, dimmed, and stabilized at a low brownout level. A distant hollow klaxon began to sound in the corridors, the automated warning of a downgraded municipal credit rating. Outside the office, the faint sounds of shouting could be heard, as payment terminals locked transit doors, sealed shut for lack of toll clearance, and the invisible scaffolding of a civilization collapsed inward. Ainsley closed his eyes. The migraine throbbed relentlessly. There was no explosion, no gunfire, just the quiet, methodical sound of a world being erased by a ledger. He had won. Humanity had won. And Ainsley Steeves had never felt more like a monster. Blinking amber hazard lights washed the corroded bulkheads of Station Jericho in a sickly, jaundiced glow. Ainsley pushed his way through the congested central promenade, his bad knee flaring with white-hot spikes of agony every time his heavy boots struck the deck grating. The ambient temperature had already dropped 4 degrees. Automated life support routines were mercilessly cutting non-essential heating to preserve the dwindling, unfunded energy grid. Air circulation fans groaned, above struggling against the sudden throttling of their power intakes. The air tasted stale, thick with the sour musk of unwashed bodies, panic sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of overloaded circuitry. All around him, society was dissolving into a bureaucratic nightmare. The promenade's commercial sector, usually a deafening bazaar of alien merchants and human grifters, had been reduced to a chaotic gridlock. Holographic storefronts flickered and died, replaced by stark red text blocks declaring insufficient funds. Account frozen. Hundreds of stranded commuters hammered their fists against the reinforced glass of the transit gates. The automated turnstiles refused to budge. Commuter passes linked directly to the planetary banking hubs now held 0 value. People were trapped. They couldn't buy a ration bar, let alone a shuttle ticket back to the surface. Ainsley kept his head down, pulling the collar of his charcoal suit tight against the encroaching chill. He hated the way they looked at the screens. It wasn't the blind terror of a kinetic bombardment. It was worse. It was the slow, crushing realization of utter helplessness. A plasma strike killed you in a microsecond. A frozen bank account strangled you over weeks. He ducked into a narrow, dimly lit service corridor to avoid the main throng, seeking the quiet isolation of the lower maintenance decks. His destination was a grimy, unlicensed cantina near the primary coolant pumps. He needed a drink that didn't come out of a DRM-locked synthesizer. The heavy blast door of the cantina squealed on neglected hinges as Ainsley shoved it open. The smell of cheap fermented potato alcohol and synthetic tobacco smoke hit him like a physical blow. The place was packed but eerily silent. Men and women in oil-stained coveralls sat hunched over scratched polymer tables, staring into the bottoms of glass tumblers. Ainsley limped to the bar and slapped a solid physical palladium coin onto the sticky counter. The bartender, a scarred veteran from the Outer Rim colonies, eyed the metal with naked greed, snatched it, and slid a glass of amber liquid back. "It's funny," a heavy, gravelly voice rasped from the shadows at the end of the bar. "A week ago, that coin would have bought you a polite smile and a digital transfer. Today, it buys you the whole damn bottle." Ainsley didn't turn around. He recognized the heavy, labored breathing. "Harrison." The dockmaster stepped into the dim light, clutching a half-empty glass. His grease-stained uniform looked darker in the gloom, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. "They fired my entire crew, Steves," Harrison said. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was hollowed out, scraped clean of any fight. 4,000 engineers, mechanics, and loaders. The Guild's automated HR system sent out termination notices to their datapads simultaneously. Didn't even pay out their accrued leave. "The Guild didn't fire them, Harrison," Ainsley replied quietly, staring into his drink. "Their employer defaulted. The company dissolved. There is no payroll to draw from." "Semantics," Harrison spat, slamming his glass onto the counter. The sharp crack made several patrons flinch. "You starved them. I watched men who survived the Orion campaigns sit on the deck and cry because they can't afford the localized oxygen tax to keep their kids breathing back on the habitat rings. You did this." Ainsley closed his eyes. The migraine pulsed behind his temples, a rhythmic drumbeat of guilt. He gripped his glass, the cold condensation chilling his calloused fingers. "We stopped a war, Harrison. The Council wanted to break the outer colonies, turn them into indentured client states. They were going to do it legally, bleeding them through tariffs. We just flipped the board. By blowing up the entire room." Harrison laughed, a dry, barking sound devoid of humor. "You banking guild suits are all the same. You think because there's no shrapnel your hands are clean. Look at my hands, Ainsley." Harrison shoved his massive scarred hands under the dim light. They were trembling. "I spent 20 years building ships. Real things. Things you could touch. You spent 5 minutes tapping a screen and you erased it all. You didn't beat the Council, Steves. You just proved humanity is exactly the plague they said we were." Harrison turned and lumbered toward the exit. He didn't look back. The blast door screeched shut, sealing Ainsley in the dim, stale air of the cantina. Ainsley swallowed the cheap liquor. It burned a fiery path down his throat, tasting of industrial solvent and regret. He looked at his own hands. They were perfectly clean. Not a speck of grime, not a drop of moisture. He hated them. Fluorescent tubes hummed a dying, off-key note above Brianna's head, casting long, erratic shadows across the cramped office. Ainsley pushed the door open, the stale air of the corridor rushing in to mix with the overpowering stench of burnt chicory. Brianna was standing this time. She leaned over her desk, both hands planted flat on the chaotic stacks of physical ledgers, her eyes wide and fixed on the massive central monitor. The aggressive reds and greens of the financial derivatives had vanished. In their place was a live optical feed from Station Jericho's orbital sensors. Tell me you see this, Brianna muttered, her voice tight, strung tight as piano wire. Ainsley limped forward, his jaw clenching as he looked at the screen, slipping silently out of the dark void of space. Massive silhouettes eclipsed the distant starlight. They were colossal vessels, dwarfing even the seized Vanguard currently resting in the dry dock. Their hulls were painted a blinding, immaculate white, adorned with massive luminescent blue rings, the universal symbol of the Galactic Assembly's Medical and Disaster Relief Commission. Hospital ships, Ainsley said, his brows knitting together in confusion. 3 of them. Vanguard-class mass. Why is the Council deploying a medical fleet to a financial crisis? Look closer at the hull geometry, Brianna snapped, pointing a trembling finger at the display. Those aren't medical frigates. Look at the plating thickness around the primary drives. Look at the reinforced docking umbilicals. Ainsley leaned in his military training, overriding his exhausted auditor's brain. The sleek white paint hid the brutalist angular architecture of troop carriers. The medical umbilicals were armored boarding tubes. The sensor arrays were configured for targeting, not triage. They're armored marine transports. Ainsley breathed the chilling reality washing over him. They just painted them white. Belmont isn't finished, Brianna said, her fingers flying across the keyboard to pull up the public Galactic comms feed. Listen to this. The smooth, oiled glass voice of Governor Charles Belmont filled the small office, accompanied by a holographic projection of him standing before the assembly podium. He looked somber, grave, and perfectly composed. A catastrophic, humanitarian crisis unfolding in the Jericho sector, Belmont's broadcast echoed. Millions of sentients are facing imminent starvation and asphyxiation due to the reckless and predatory actions of rogue financial entities. The Galactic Council cannot in good conscience allow this tragedy to proceed. Therefore, under the Emergency Disaster Relief Act, we are deploying our medical fleet to seize control of all vital infrastructure, including the agricultural freighters and defensive assets, to ensure the uninterrupted flow of life-saving resources. Brianna slammed her fist onto the desk. He found a loophole. He can't break the financial contracts, so he's bypassing the economy entirely. He's declaring the sector a disaster zone to legally commandeer the collateral. It's a military occupation disguised as a charity mission, Ainsley said, watching the massive white ships maneuver toward the dry dock holding the Vanguard. If those troops board the dreadnought and the freighters under the flag of humanitarian aid, our smart contracts won't register it as a default or a hostile takeover. The algorithms recognize disaster relief as a neutral external event, which means the insurance policies don't trigger. Brianna realized, her pale face turning ashen. The Council takes the ships, secures the grain, and prevents the market crash. They fix the supply chain manually. Our margin call gets nullified by force. They're playing by the old rules. Ainsley said, the ache in his knee suddenly forgotten, replaced by an icy, familiar adrenaline. They brought guns to a math fight. The treaty banned war, but it didn't ban disaster management. If we try to stop them, we become the villains blocking medical aid. On the monitor, the lead white ship extended a massive armored boarding tube toward the Vanguard's primary airlock. Warning klaxons, the station's automated proximity alerts began to wail through the hull, a mournful, oscillating shriek. I'm locked out. Brianna frantically typed lines of code reflecting in her manic eyes. The docking master override has been physically severed from the outside. The Council ships are using analog hard-line overrides. They aren't talking to our servers. They're just cutting the digital locks. Ainsley stared at the screen. He saw the cold, efficient military precision in the way the Council ships boxed in the dry dock. He remembered Belmont's condescending smile. The governor thought humanity was just a bunch of spreadsheet jockeys who would fold the moment physical force was applied. They think we forgot how to fight, Ainsley murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous gravelly register. "We can't fight them. Ainsley!" Brianna yelled over the rising wail of the proximity alerts. "They have thousands of armored marines in those ships. We have frozen accounts and angry commuters." "They aren't fighting us," Ainsley said, stepping away from the desk and moving toward the heavy iron door. "They are performing an emergency disaster intervention. We need to respect the law, Brianna. We just need to define the disaster." "Where are you going?" Brianna called out. "Pier 4. Ainsley replied, not looking back. "Harrison told me those ships were built by people who work with their hands. I need to borrow some tools." Ainsley stepped back out into the freezing, dimly lit corridor. The station felt different now. The panic of poverty had been replaced by the heavy, oppressive weight of an impending invasion. The council was coming to take their leverage, wrapping their tyranny in the sterile, white bandages of humanitarian aid. He broke into a heavy, agonizing jog. Every step sent a jolt of fire through his ruined knee, but he forced his mind to lock the pain away in a dark corner. He was no longer Ainsley Steeves, senior auditor of the Soul Banking Guild. He was Ainsley Steeves' gunnery sergeant Sirius campaign, and he was about to weaponize the only physical asset they had left. The heavy steel of the maintenance turbo-lift doors parted, and Ainsley stepped inside, slamming his palm against the control panel for the lowest engineering subdeck. He needed to reach the primary industrial control nexus before the Council Marines breached the Vanguard's airlock. Humanity had built the dry docks. They had built the massive automated fusion cutters used to shear through starship armor during salvage operations. These weren't weapons, they were tools. Highly regulated, purely industrial tools. And if a massive synchronized industrial accident were to occur while a foreign ship was illegally tethering to their dry dock, well, the Galactic Council's insurance premiums were about to go up. Grease slicked the metal rungs of the maintenance ladder, making Ainsley's descent a slippery, agonizing ordeal. His right knee protested with sharp, sickening pops as he dropped into the subterranean belly of Pier 4. The air down here didn't just smell bad. It had a physical weight. It tasted of sulfur-atomized hydraulic fluid and raw, unfiltered fusion runoff. Ainsley found Harrison exactly where he expected, slumped inside the primary control gantry, overlooking the dry dock's massive robotic arms. The dockmaster held a heavy hydro spanner, turning it over and over in his massive hands, staring blankly through the thick armor-glass window at the blinding white hull of the council ship, moving into position. "They're taking the ship, Harrison," Ainsley rasped, leaning heavily against the reinforced steel doorframe. He was sweating through his suit, the charcoal wool clinging to his skin like a wet shroud. Harrison didn't look away from the glass. "I see them." "Medical aid. Makes you want to throw up. I need the salvage cutters online." Harrison finally turned. His eyes were bloodshot, tracking Ainsley's disheveled appearance. "The cutters, Steeves, those are Class 4 industrial shears. We use them to crack open decommissioned cruisers. You point one of those at a council vessel, they'll vaporize you for hostile military action." "It's not military action," Ainsley said, pushing himself off the frame and limping toward the control console. "It's an industrial accident, a tragic malfunction caused by an unauthorized vessel attempting to hard dock with an uncalibrated commercial gantry." Harrison stared at him. The dockmaster's heavy brow furrowed as the realization slowly chewed through his alcohol-numbed brain. "You want to shear off their boarding tube? I want to crush the umbilical pin the forward sensor array with the cargo clamps and flood their primary intake vents with ionized coolant," Ainsley corrected, slapping his palm against the master override switch. A red "Access Denied" flashed across the screen. "But I don't have the clearance. You do." Harrison looked at his own terminal, then down at the hydro spanner in his hands. If I do this, they'll throw me in a penal colony for corporate sabotage. If you don't do this, they take the vanguard. They take the grain. The market stabilizes, our margins evaporate, and your crew starves anyway, Ainsley said. His voice was flat, devoid of heroic pitch. You built these docks, Harrison. You know exactly how much pressure a magnetic cargo clamp can exert before it's classified as a kinetic weapon. Keep it under the legal limit. Just make sure it hurts. A muscle jumped in Harrison's jaw. He dropped the spanner. It clanged loudly against the steel deck. He shoved Ainsley aside with a heavy shoulder and slammed his grease-stained thumb onto the biometric scanner. The console flared an angry operational green. Manual override engaged. Harrison muttered, his hands flying across the tactile switches with practiced, brutal efficiency. Rerouting power from the station's tertiary life support into the gantry hydraulics. It's going to get very cold in the promenade. Outside the armor-glass window, the silent ballet of the dry dock transformed into a violent mechanical spasm. Massive yellow-painted robotic arms, thick as redwood trunks and designed for hauling starship engines, suddenly jerked awake. The Council hospital ship had already extended its boarding umbilical, a heavily armored tube disguised as a triage corridor, and magnetically locked it onto the Vanguard's airlock. Applying pressure, Harrison said. 2 salvage clamps swung inward with terrifying speed. They didn't strike the Council ship that would be an attack. Instead, they clamped onto the boarding umbilical itself. The heavy machinery whined servos, screaming as they applied thousands of tons of crushing force. The armored tube crumpled like cheap tin. Sparks showered into the vacuum of space, a brilliant cascade of white and blue light. The Council ship lurched its proximity alarms, finally realizing that the station itself was tearing it apart. Now the cutters, Ainsley said, his chest heaving. Harrison triggered the industrial fusion torches. Twin beams of intense, blinding violet light erupted from the gantry's lower mandibles. They sliced upward, not aiming for the hull, but cleanly severing the heavy magnetic docking tethers the Council ship had fired into the station's superstructure. The violent separation caused the massive white vessel to list heavily to starboard. The ruined boarding tube tore completely away from the Vanguard, violently depressurizing the Council ship's forward airlock. Through the optical feed, Ainsley could see armored Marines, not medics, scrambling backward to seal the breach. Accident complete, Harrison breathed, stepping back from the console. His hands were shaking again, but this time it was pure adrenaline. Ainsley gripped the railing, his knuckles white. The Council ship was backing away, venting atmosphere and coolant into the void. They hadn't fired a shot. They hadn't killed anyone. But they had violently rejected the boarding party, using nothing but zoning violations and heavy machinery. They'll be back, Harrison said, his voice grim. They have 2 more ships in orbit. They won't, Ainsley replied, pulling out his cracked datapad. Because now it's Brianna's turn. Frigid air blasted from the ventilation shafts in Brianna's office. The power reroute had killed the localized heating, leaving the room feeling like a meat locker. Brianna didn't seem to notice. She sat bathed in the glow of her monitors, typing with a frantic, unblinking intensity. The heavy door swung open, and Charles Belmont stepped inside. He had entirely lost his oiled glass composure. His immaculate suit was rumpled, a faint sheen of sweat covered his forehead, despite the freezing temperature, and his jaw was set in a tight, furious line. 2 heavily armed council guards flanked him in the hallway, though they remained outside the threshold. "You are under arrest," Belmont hissed, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Both you and Mr. Steves. You attacked a Galactic Council medical vessel. You caused severe structural damage and depressurized a triage wing. That is an act of war, Miss Cook." "It was a tragic industrial accident, Governor," Brianna replied, mildly, finally looking up from her screen. She picked up her ceramic mug, took a sip of the freezing chicory, and set it down. Station Jericho's automated docking pylons are severely undermaintained due to the recent sovereign default. When your ship attempted an unauthorized hard dock, the automated fail-safes glitched. "Do not insult my intelligence!" Belmont slammed his fist onto her desk, rattling the stacks of ledgers. "I have the telemetry. Someone manually activated those fusion cutters." "You have telemetry showing a system failure." Brianna corrected her voice, hardening into steel. "And honestly, Governor Belmont, the accident, is the least of your problems right now. I suggest you look at your inbox." Belmont frowned his hand instinctively, reaching for the slim platinum datapad in his breast pocket. He pulled it out, tapping the screen. His eyes scanned the text, and Ainsley, who had just limped into the room behind him, watched the man's face drain of color for the second time that day. "What is this?" Belmont whispered. "That is a liability invoice," Brianna said cheerfully. She spun her monitor around so Belmont could see the stark, unfeeling spreadsheet. Infraction for 1 unauthorized docking with a privately held corporate asset, the Vanguard. Infraction 2, negligent operation of a vessel in a commercial dry dock, resulting in catastrophic damage to primary salvage pylons. Infraction 3, reckless endangerment of Soul Banking Guild employees. Your medical ship didn't have commercial clearance to dock at Pier 4. Brianna explained, leaning back and crossing her arms. By attempting a forced connection, your vessel initiated an automated hazard response. You destroyed 3 of our Class 4 salvage clamps. Those are expensive. "You attacked us," Belmont sputtered. "You can't bill us for the machinery you used to rip our ship apart." "Oh, but I can. And I did." Brianna smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. The Interstellar Trade Commission's own guidelines clearly state that any damage caused during an unsanctioned docking procedure places sole financial liability on the intruding party. I've already filed the claim with the Central Arbitration Node. Ainsley watched Belmont closely. The governor was breathing shallowly, his eyes darting across the screen. "The damages amount to 40 million credits." Belmont sneered, recovering a fraction of his arrogance. "A drop in the bucket for the council treasury. We will pay the fine, impound this station, and arrest you." "You missed the bottom line, Charles," Brianna said softly. She tapped a key. The monitor shifted to a second page of the invoice. "The physical damages are 40 million, miss," Brianna continued. "But the Vanguard is a collateralized asset tied to a massive web of derivative insurance policies. Your unauthorized docking attempt and the subsequent structural violence was flagged by the Central Exchange as a hostile corporate raid. The market algorithms panicked. They assumed the collateral was compromised." Belmont stared at the screen. The numbers there were not in the millions. They weren't even in the billions. "You triggered a localized market crash," Brianna whispered. "And because the council is financially liable for the incident that caused the panic, you are now legally responsible for the margin shortfall of the entire sector." Ainsley leaned against the doorframe, letting the cold air soothe his aching muscles. "She's right, Governor. You didn't just break a docking clamp. You broke the chain of custody on a 3 trillion credit debt structure. And under the laws you wrote to prevent war, you owe us the balance. Immediately." Belmont looked like a man who had just been told he was falling, but hadn't yet hit the ground. The reality of the numbers was suffocating him. There was no army he could deploy to fight a margin call. There were no plasma batteries that could vaporize a digitally verified insurance claim. If the council pays this," Belmont stammered, his voice utterly broken, "it will bankrupt the relief funds for 3 star systems. Millions will suffer. Then I suggest you get your hospital ships out of our dry dock, withdraw your humanitarian disaster declaration, and let us foreclose on this sector in peace." Brianna said, her tone devoid of empathy. "If you leave now, I will graciously withdraw the liability claim. We keep the Vanguard. We keep the planet. The Council keeps its treasury." Belmont stood frozen. The sheer sociopathic perfection of the trap paralyzed him. He had tried to use physical force disguised as charity, and humanity had weaponized liability to destroy him. He slowly lowered his datapad. The fight had completely left his eyes, replaced by a hollow, sickening defeat. Without a word, he turned on his heel. He didn't look at Ainsley. He didn't look at his guards. He simply walked down the freezing corridor, a broken man in a pristine suit. Ainsley listened to the echoing scuff of Belmont's expensive shoes fading into the distance. "He's going to withdraw the ships," Ainsley said quietly, the exhaustion finally overtaking him. He slid down the doorframe, sitting heavily on the cold floor. "Of course he is," Brianna said, turning her monitor back around. She immediately resumed typing, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light. The math left him no choice. Ainsley rubbed his bad knee, staring at the scuffed linoleum. They had repelled a boarding party, secured a planetary asset, and defeated a Galactic Council governor. It was a flawless victory. But as Ainsley sat in the freezing, stale air, listening to the frantic clacking of Brianna's keyboard, he couldn't shake the smell of scorched metal and cheap liquor from his mind. He closed his eyes, and all he could see was Harrison's trembling hands. The galaxy was safe from war, but Ainsley knew deep in his bones that humanity had just invented something much, much worse. Gravity on the primary breadbasket world of Series 9 dragged at Ainsley's bones with ruthless, exhausting persistence. The orbital shuttle's boarding ramp lowered with a sharp hydraulic hiss, instantly exposing him to a biting dry wind that smelled faintly of ammonia and crushed dried silica. He gripped the textured metal handrail, tightly leaning his weight onto his good leg as he descended onto the cracked, sun-bleached permacrete of the landing pad. The sky above was a bruised synthetic purple, its natural blue choked out by the failing atmospheric scrubbers. The Sol Banking Guild had remotely dialed the terraforming engines down to 30% capacity the moment the foreclosure was finalized. It was a simple cost-saving measure, calculated by a blind algorithm in a server room 3 systems away. Here on the ground, it meant the air scraped the back of Ainsley's throat like inhaled fiberglass. There were no massive explosions here, no scorched craters or orbital bombardments leveling cities. The devastation was entirely silent. Series 9 was an agricultural hub, a world that should have been deafening, with the roar of heavy harvesters, the thrum of suborbital grain lifters, and the shouting of 1 million dock workers. Instead, an oppressive, suffocating quiet blanketed the vast plains. Thousands of towering metallic grain silos stretched toward the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows over fields of unharvested, rotting synthetic wheat. Standing at the base of the landing pad was Magistrate Elias Miller. He did not look like a planetary leader. He wore a faded, dust-stained utility coat, and his shoulders slumped under the invisible crushing weight of planetary bankruptcy. Miller's face was deeply lined, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with the kind of absolute exhaustion that only came from looking your people in the eye and telling them they no longer owned the dirt beneath their feet. Ainsley limped forward, his knee popping in the natural gravity. He pulled his datapad from his jacket pocket. The screen was already displaying the transfer of deeds. "You came to count the dirt yourself, Steves?" Miller asked. His voice was a dry, raspy scrape. There was no anger left in it, just a hollowed-out resignation that made Ainsley's stomach twist. Guild protocol mandates a physical audit of all seized primary assets, exceeding 1 trillion credits. Ainsley recited, retreating behind the sterile armor of corporate bureaucracy. I need you to authorize the biometric handover of the central processing hubs. Miller stared at him. The wind whipped a flurry of abrasive red dust against Ainsley's charcoal suit, coating the fine wool in a layer of grime. Your algorithms already locked us out of the water reservoirs, Ainsley. My people can't even irrigate their private gardens without paying a microtransaction to a bank on Earth. What more do you need me to sign over? The operational keys to the orbital tethers, Ainsley said, holding out the datapad. Until the physical grain is exported, the asset remains unsecured. We are bringing in automated lifters to empty the silos. Miller slowly reached out his hand, trembling slightly, and pressed his thumb against the glowing green reader. A quiet chime confirmed the complete surrender of a world's sovereign wealth. I thought you people were better than the Council, Miller murmured, wiping his dusty hand on his coat. When you sold us those loans, you told us you were protecting our independence. You said capital was freedom. It was a business arrangement, Ainsley said, struggling to keep his voice entirely flat. You leveraged your infrastructure to build a fleet you couldn't afford. The market corrected. The market, Miller scoffed, shaking his head. He turned and pointed a calloused finger toward a cluster of low, blocky, residential habs situated a mile from the silos. Do you know what happens when the market decides to throttle the atmospheric scrubbers to save on the daily energy dividend? The children get nosebleeds. The elderly go into respiratory arrest. You didn't just repossess our grain, Steves. You repossessed our oxygen. The Council wanted to tax us into submission. You just suffocated us. Ainsley looked at the habs. The windows were dark. The power grid had been localized to essential corporate assets only. Millions of people were sitting in the freezing dark, breathing thin, toxic air, simply because their government missed a bond payment. He remembered the trenches of Sirius. He remembered the heat of a plasma burn, the chaotic, screaming frenzy of a frontline assault. He had joined the guild to escape the slaughter. He had truly believed that laws and ledgers were a civilized alternative to violence. But looking at Miller's defeated, ash-stained face, Ainsley realized the horrifying truth. Kinetic war gave the enemy a chance to shoot back. Economic war stripped them of their weapons, their shelter, and their breath, all while telling them it was just business. The automated lifters will arrive in 3 hours, Ainsley said, unable to meet Miller's eyes any longer. The guild will issue a ration dividend once the silos are empty. You won't starve. No, Miller said softly, turning his back on Ainsley and walking slowly toward the dark habs. We'll just live on our knees. A clean, bloodless slaughter. Congratulations on your victory, Auditor. Ainsley stood alone on the landing pad, the wind howling around him. The datapad in his hand felt unnaturally heavy. He pocketed it, the screen cold against his palm, and turned back toward the shuttle. His knee ached terribly, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the sickening realization of what he had become. He wasn't a peacemaker. He was a repo man for an empire built on paper. Fluorescent overhead lights in Station Jericho were blindingly bright, casting a harsh, sterile glare across the central promenade. The dim, jaundiced glow of the brownout was gone. Soul banking had flooded the station's municipal grid with fresh capital the moment the Galactic Council's hospital ships broke orbit and the planetary assets were legally secured. The transformation was absolute and deeply unsettling. The desperate stranded commuters who had battered the transit gates were gone, quietly deported or absorbed into the guild's indentured labor pools. In their place, corporate security contractors in sleek black armor patrolled the clean scrubbed decks. The air no longer smelled of panic sweat and cheap potato liquor. It smelled of ozone, industrial bleach, and synthetic lavender. Ainsley walked through the pristine corridors, his boots making no sound on the freshly polished linoleum. He felt entirely out of place in his rumpled, dust-stained suit. He reached the administrative sector and pushed open the door to Brianna's office. The claustrophobic box of chaotic ledgers and burnt chicory had been erased. Brianna now occupied a massive, sweeping suite overlooking the dry docks. The physical paper was gone, replaced by seamless holographic interfaces that floated silently above a massive obsidian desk. Brianna stood by the expansive armor-glass window, holding a crystal glass of actual non-synthetic water. She looked rested, her pale skin devoid of the manic exhaustion that usually clung to her. She wore a sharply tailored white suit that perfectly matched the new sterile aesthetic of the station. "Ainsley," she smiled, turning to face him. It was a genuine smile, devoid of the predatory edge he was used to. "Earth confirmed the asset transfer. The margin call holds. The Council's central exchange is in absolute chaos, trying to cover the localized deficit. We broke their financial leverage across the entire sector." "I saw the localized deficit," Ainsley said, stepping into the room. He didn't sit. "I was on Series 9. The scrubbers are failing, B. People are choking on the dust." Brianna's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened slightly. "The atmospheric grid is an uncollateralized liability. If we run it at full capacity, it eats into the profit margins of the grain export. They can survive on 30% until they learn to balance their own planetary budget." "They're children, Brianna. They are data points in a sovereign default," she corrected, smoothly setting her glass on the desk. "You need to compartmentalize, Ainsley. We won. Humanity holds the high ground now. Earth just authorized a massive executive bonus pool for this division. Your share is enough to buy a private island in the Mediterranean." Ainsley looked at the holographic projections, watching the aggressive green lines of Saul Banking's stock climbing vertically. He was rich, incomprehensibly rich. He had traded his soul for a ledger, and the ledger had paid out. "I need access to the primary payroll node for the Vanguard's decommissioned crew," Ainsley said, ignoring the mention of the bonus. Brianna frowned slightly. "That company is dissolved. The payroll node is archived. I want to review the archive." Ainsley lied his voice, dropping into the flat authoritative rumble he used during audits. "I need to ensure no outstanding severance clauses can be weaponized against us by local labor tribunals." Brianna studied him for a long moment, searching for a crack in his corporate facade. Finding none, she sighed and flicked a finger across her console. "Access granted. But don't waste too much time on dead accounts. We have 3 more planetary systems to audit by the end of the quarter." Ainsley nodded, once turned, and limped out of the spotless office. He didn't go to his quarters. He went down into the bowels of the station, past the polished promenade, descending into the grimy, neglected subdecks that the guild hadn't bothered to sanitize yet. He found Harrison in the same unlicensed cantina, sitting in the dark, a half-empty bottle of cheap solvent liquor in front of him. The dockmaster looked up his face, a roadmap of deep, bitter lines. He didn't say a word. Ainsley slid into the booth opposite him. He pulled out a small encrypted data chip and placed it on the sticky-scratched polymer table. "What is that?" Harrison rasped, eyeing the chip with deep suspicion. "A routing key," Ainsley said quietly. He leaned forward, keeping his voice below the hum of the failing ventilation unit. "I used my executive override. I set up a ghost subsidiary deeply buried in the logistics budget of the Series 9 grain export. Every time a freighter leaves orbit, a fraction of a % of the shipping tariff is siphoned into an untraceable union trust." Harrison stared at the chip, then slowly up at Ainsley. "A fraction of a % of a multi-trillion credit yield," Ainsley confirmed. "It's enough to cover the localized oxygen taxes for your crew's families. It's enough to keep them fed. It will bypass the frozen accounts." Harrison didn't reach for the chip. He looked at Ainsley with a mixture of contempt and weary sorrow. "You starved a planet, Steves. You brought the council to its knees using paperwork, and you threw millions into the dark. Do you think a stolen pension fund buys your conscience back? No, Ainsley said. The honesty of the word tasted like ash in his mouth. My conscience died on Sirius. This isn't redemption, Harrison. It's just an accounting error. Harrison sat in silence for a long time. The heavy oppressive air of the cantina pressed down on them both. Finally, the dockmaster's massive scarred hand reached out and swept the chip off the table, dropping it into his grease-stained pocket. He didn't offer a word of thanks. He just looked away, staring into the bottom of his glass. Ainsley stood up. His knee flared a sharp reminder of the physical world he could no longer truly touch. He left the cantina, the heavy blast door squealing shut behind him, sealing him back into the cold, calculated corridors of his own making. He walked to the nearest observation deck and stood before the massive armor-glass window. Outside, the seized dreadnought Vanguard hung silently in the void, surrounded by a swarm of automated guild drones. Beyond it, the stars burned with cold, indifferent light. There were no flashing lasers, no dramatic explosions, no heroic last stands. Humanity had finally achieved absolute peace in the galaxy, and all it cost was everything else. Thank you for experiencing this grim chapter of human survival in a ruthless galaxy. If this dark dive into the weaponization of economics and the cold reality of interstellar debt kept you captivated, please hit that like button to feed the algorithm. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi junkies who appreciate a grounded, cynical twist on the genre, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a future upload. Drop a comment below. How would you fight back against a galactic bank? Your engagement keeps these stories alive. See you in the next thrilling one.